The coffee shop smelled like burnt sugar and yesterday's rain, a slow drift of steam curling off the counter. I sat at the corner table, my hands around a mug that was too hot, stirring it absent-mindedly, counting the seconds in the drip of the old espresso machine. The barista called out a name, and a few people shifted chairs, but I stayed tucked against the wall watching. She came in like she had somewhere else to be but decided not to rush. My landlady, though I'd only just realized how much I was noticing her mid-40s, cardigan a shade too soft for this November chill, hair tucked behind her ears as she scanned the menu like she was solving a puzzle. Her voice was quiet, deliberate. I caught the tail end of her order, black, no sugar, please, and remembered it without thinking. That small act, remembering, made something ache in my chest. I looked down at my phone, thumb hovering over a text I'd written but couldn't send. She didn't know, and part of me didn't want her to. It wasn't that I wanted anything from her, not exactly. It was that the spaces she occupied, even for a few minutes, rearranged the quiet corners of my day. Her eyes flicked up. She noticed me noticing her, or maybe she just glanced at me by chance. But there was a pause that lingered too long to be casual. I looked back at my mug, pretending I hadn't felt the small current of awareness. My fingers traced the rim, tapping lightly, like a metronome to a song I couldn't hear. "You got the usual," she said, sliding into the seat across from me without waiting for a yes. She didn't need permission, and I didn't have the words to give it. "Yeah," I said, voice softer than intended. I wanted to sound casual, but it came out like an afterthought. She smiled, small and hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should. Then she reached for her cup, fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second, quick enough to make me jerk my hand slightly back. I noticed the faint perfume of rain and something floral I couldn't name. My chest tightened. I asked, how's your day been?" "Busy," she said, eyes flicking to the window, then back. "I feel guilty already." I paused. The words sank somewhere low, under my ribs. My first instinct was to say something witty, but the truth came out like spilled sugar. "Then, let me share the guilt," I murmured, half smile, half question. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes softened, and she took a slow sip of her coffee. Her hands were quiet on the mug, thumb tracing the curve absent-mindedly. I found myself watching that small motion, the way her sleeve slid back slightly as her skin caught the pale morning light. I wanted to say more. I wanted to ask why, or if it was something I could fix. But I didn't. Silence was easier. The kind of silence that fills a room without pressure, just two people existing in it, noticing each other. When she finally stood, bag in hand, I realized I'd forgotten to breathe properly. She looked at me, lips twitching as if she might say something else, then didn't. Just a nod, a soft lift of her eyebrows, and she was gone. I sat there a little longer, tracing the rim of my cup again, thinking about the words that had passed between us, the weight in them, and the way her glance had lingered longer than necessary. My phone buzzed on the table. A message. I hadn't expected one, but there it was, her name. I didn't look at it right away. I let it sit, letting the quiet stretch. The kind of quiet that makes you realize you're not sure if you want to break it. Or if you're afraid to. I saw her again a few days later, in the hallway of the building, balancing a stack of mail and a small potted plant she'd borrowed from the lobby. She was crouched slightly, nudging the plant into the box, muttering to herself. "Need a hand?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice came out softer than I'd intended. She glanced up, surprise flickering across her face. "Oh thanks," she said, pushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Her hands were small and precise, moving like she'd done this 100 times but still wanted it perfect. I handed her the heather envelope without thinking too much, and our fingers brushed again. This time, I didn't pull back. I remember when my mom used to make me help her organize letters like this, she said almost to herself. She had all these boxes. Colors, dates, everything. I nodded, waiting. She didn't ask me anything in return, but the silence didn't feel empty. I found myself imagining her in a kitchen I'd never been in, the faint aroma of bread and tea, her laugh echoing off old walls. There was a hesitation in her eyes when she looked at me, something unspoken. Divorced, living alone in this building she managed me, barely scraping together rent in the corner apartment. 23 3 and unsure if I'd even notice the weight in my own chest if it weren't for these stolen moments. Do you like tea? She asked suddenly, pulling a thermos from her bag. I make it too strong sometimes. Sure, I said. We ended up sitting on the small lobby bench, cups steaming in our hands. The city sounds muted behind the thick glass. We didn't talk much. She stirred sugar absent-mindedly, watching it dissolve, while I traced patterns on the rim of my cup with my thumb. At some point, she laughed quietly at something I hadn't said out loud. It wasn't a full laugh, just enough to tilt her shoulders, to reveal that part of her she didn't show everyone. And I felt that strange pull again, the one that made ordinary things, like handing a mail envelope, feel like confessions. I thought about how strange it was, this, whatever it was. My mind spun small, improbable scenarios, walking home together, talking about movies neither of us had seen, her leaning on my shoulder, me fumbling with words I didn't have. And then a quick jolt of guilt. None of those scenarios were safe, or even appropriate really. She caught my gaze, and for a heartbeat, the world shrank to the lobby, to the hum of the heater, to the warmth of the tea. You know, she said softly, sometimes I forget people notice the little things, like the way you remember orders or small details. I swallowed, unsure what to say. Words felt too blunt. Instead, I nudged her cup slightly, just enough so it touched hers. It wasn't much, barely a touch, but it carried a weight I couldn't name. She didn't move away. Instead, she let her fingers linger near the rim, and we stayed like that, silent but tethered. I didn't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. The elevator smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet shoes. I pressed the button for the 3rd floor, pretending not to notice that she stepped in just after me. Hey, she said softly, shifting the stack of folders in her hands. Her sleeve brushed mine for a fraction of a second. Not close enough. Hey, I said. My voice sounded flat even to me. I wanted to ask if she had a minute, if she wanted to sit somewhere quiet, but the words tangled in my throat. We rode in silence. The numbers lit up slowly. I watched her hands, how they gripped the edges of the folders, knuckles pale, thumb tapping lightly. My chest felt tight. At the 3rd floor I held the door, and she hesitated before stepping out. Something in her eyes. Hesitation, maybe caution, maybe a question I didn't know how to answer. I thought about reaching for her hand, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped slightly to the side. She smiled small, almost apologetic. I should get these upstairs before the meeting, she murmured. Right, I said, my lips pressed together, trying to keep the flutter from escaping. The hum of the hallway made the pause stretch longer than it should have. She glanced at me, and I swear for a moment she was looking at more than my face. She tilted her head, uncertain, like she might say something she shouldn't. I imagined her leaning closer, just a fraction, and my heart picked up. A knock echoed down the hall. One of the other tenants stepped out, distracted. She flinched, adjusting the folders against her chest. I stepped back instinctively. The moment fractured, leaving the air between us heavy and quiet. I could feel it. The near collision of what wasn't meant to be. The way her fingers lingered near the edge of the folders, her gaze flicking to the floor, then back to me. I wanted to ask, to confess some tiny piece of what I felt, but a part of me froze. See you later, she said finally, voice a shade too casual. Yeah, I said, nodding. My hand itched to reach for her, to linger at the small of her back as she walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, stomach tight, watching her retreat. When the elevator dinged again behind me, I imagined her stepping in, imagined her leaning closer, imagined the brush of lips I didn't allow myself to think of fully. I shook my head, blinking at the carpet, at the hallway light that seemed too bright, too stark. A whisper of a thought ran through me. What if I never get this close again? What if this hesitation becomes distance, just as easily as it becomes, whatever it could be? Her door closed softly before I could move. I stayed in the hallway longer than necessary, just tracing the echo of her footsteps with my eyes. Nearly crossed the line, nearly. The park bench was damp, left over from an early drizzle. I sat on the edge, elbows on my knees, watching her untangle the strap of her bag. She didn't look at me at first, just tilted her head, hair falling over one shoulder, lost in the rhythm of snapping and unsnapping. You always wait for me to finish, she asked, voice quiet, but not a question really. I shrugged, unsure what to say. I guess I just notice. My words trailed off, leaving the space between us thick. She glanced at me then, eyes softer than I expected. Something in her held for a second longer than it should have. Her hand lingered near the clasp of her bag. I noticed the faint tremble in her fingers and realized she was holding herself together, or maybe holding back. I wanted to ask what, exactly, but the words refused me. Instead, I shifted closer, careful not to touch, careful to seem casual. You okay? She laughed softly, but it was brittle, edges sharp. I don't know. Sometimes I get jealous, I guess. I don't know, the way life keeps moving without waiting. Her confession landed awkwardly between us. I felt my own chest tighten, the kind of tightening that made me aware of my pulse, of my hands, of the slight brush my jeans against the damp bench. I don't want to mess this up, she said, barely audible. Then, after a pause, and I feel guilty already, I swallowed, thinking of all the ways I could tell her she didn't have to feel guilty. Or maybe that I wanted to share the guilt anyway, like last time, but something in her eyes stopped me. Something honest and raw and unspoken. We sat in silence, just breathing. I watched a leaf settle on the wet ground, its edges curled. I noticed how her eyes followed it without looking away from me completely. She started, stopped. Took a breath. Sometimes I imagine different scenarios, small things, simple, and then I think I shouldn't. I leaned slightly forward, careful. My fingers twitched against my knees, wanting to reach for hers, wanting to say the words she didn't. We didn't speak for a long time. Just that quiet, that hovering tension, that ache of almost touch, almost said. The park around us seemed distant, like we were wrapped in our own slow orbit. Finally, she looked at me fully, tilting her head, and her voice dropped to a whisper. Do you ever wonder if this is too much? I wanted to answer. I wanted to bridge the distance, to admit some piece of myself, but the words stuck. Instead, I just nodded, letting the pause say what I couldn't. And then we just sat there, her bag forgotten on the bench, the dampness seeping through the wood. Her eyes met mine one last time before she looked away. I wanted to ask the question, I wanted to cross the line. But I didn't see her for almost a week. Not in the hallway, not in the lobby, not on the bench outside the building. The space she usually filled felt heavier, quieter. I left messages I never sent. Walked past her apartment door, finger hovering over the knob as if hesitation could somehow call her out. When she finally appeared, she was brisk, a little sharper at the edges. No small smile, no soft glance, just nods that barely grazed acknowledgement. She carried a folder thicker than usual, and I noticed the way her fingers clutched it like armor. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual. But it came out stilted, hollow. Hey, she said, and then looked away, shifting her weight. Not on the bench, not even in the hallway. Just away. I wanted to ask what changed, but the words froze. Instead, I offered to help carry something. A box of mail she had tucked under her arm. She shook her head. I've got it. Her refusal cut more than I expected. Not sharp, exactly. Just deliberate. My chest ached in a quiet, spread out way. The kind that doesn't make noise but leaves a trace in your ribs. That evening, I imagined her at home, maybe sitting at her kitchen table, staring at an empty chair, or maybe not thinking about me at all. Maybe a child I didn't know, a memory of an ex, a phone call I wasn't meant to witness. A life I wasn't part of but had imagined otherwise. I kept checking my phone, thumb hovering over her name, but never sending. Each time I imagined her response, it changed, sometimes warm, sometimes sharp, sometimes nothing. I paused mid-text, deleted, paused again, deleted. She appeared briefly the next day at the corner store, picking up milk. I watched her from the aisle over, half turned, avoiding my eyes, like she knew I'd been waiting. I felt the pull to cross the space between us, to say something, anything, but something stopped me. Maybe respect, maybe fear. Maybe the uncertainty of what she might feel if I did. The mailbox dinged behind me. A letter, a note I'd meant to leave her, never delivered. It sat there in my pocket, folded and cold, unsent. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused. Like life forgot to finish the sentence. That evening, the bench outside the building stayed empty. I leaned against the railing, the dampness settling on my jacket, imagining her sitting there, pretending not to notice me, pretending we weren't tangled in these quiet lines of thought. I kept thinking of her hand near the clasp of her bag, of the tremble I saw last week, of the brief brush in the elevator. Those small moments felt like echoes now, distant and unreachable. And yet I couldn't stop noticing. Couldn't stop imagining. The page of unsent words, the bench left empty, the hallway quiet, all of it stretched between us. I found her in the kitchen of her apartment, early evening, the sun slanting through the blinds. She was rinsing a coffee cup, slow, deliberate, as if she needed the motion to steady herself. "Hey," I said, lingering in the doorway. She didn't look up at first. Just kept her hands on the cup, twisting it slightly, water dripping onto the counter. I stepped closer, careful of the small space, careful not to startle her. You didn't answer my texts," I said finally. My voice sounded foreign to me, raw in its hesitation. She set the cup down, hands shaking a little. I didn't know what to say," she admitted, eyes dropping to the counter. "I didn't know if it was right. Or fair." I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, of something baked earlier, something domestic and ordinary that felt sacred in that moment. I think I notice everything about you," I said quietly, almost to myself. "Little things, the way you move, the way you talk, the pauses, I notice." Her eyes lifted then, meeting mine, a flicker of something fragile and honest. She leaned back slightly against the counter, fingers still clasped together, knuckles pale. "I feel guilty," she whispered. "Because I shouldn't feel this. Not like this." We just looked at each other, the weight of unspoken words pressing down, heavier than anything we'd actually said. I wanted to reach for her, to brush the hair from her forehead, to make it all easier, but I stayed still. "I don't know if it's right," I said softly, "but I feel it too. I think I want to be here, with you. Even if it's complicated." She exhaled, a long, quiet breath, like she'd been holding it for days. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly. She didn't smile fully, but the corner of her lips lifted enough that it changed the room. "Okay," she said, one small word, but it carried everything. Relief, fear, acceptance, and the tiny spark of trust. I nodded, nothing more, just a nod, a shared understanding. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was careful, measured, but it was ours. We didn't cross any lines, we didn't need to. The small, quiet connection, her eyes, the tilt of her head, my hand hovering near hers, was enough for now. Enough to acknowledge what had been there all along. I noticed the way her hand lingered on the counter, just near mine, as if she might reach for it someday, and I let the moment exist exactly as it was, raw, fragile, and utterly real. Sometimes that's all you need. Weeks passed, and mornings settled into a rhythm neither of us had dared name. I'd make my way to the coffee 7 a.m., like clockwork, and she'd already be there, black coffee in hand, reading something on her phone. Sometimes our elbows brushed as we reached for the sugar, sometimes not. The world didn't shift, we just fit into the same spaces differently, easier, quieter. One rainy afternoon, I found her on the park bench. The same bench where we'd first let the silence stretch between us, watching the droplets gather on the leaves. She looked up when I sat down beside her, eyes meeting mine for the briefest second, then back to the wet branches. "You remembered," she said softly, not accusing, not teasing, just noting. I murmured, fingers brushing the edge of the bench. My thumb lingered near hers for a heartbeat. We didn't speak for a long time, just let the rain drum on the pavement around us. And somehow, that was enough. Shared tea became our little ritual, sometimes in her kitchen, sometimes in mine. Black coffee, cold coffee left untouched. Missed texts now sent, usually with a small, self-conscious smile. Her apartment smelled faintly of bread one Saturday morning. She had left the window cracked, letting in the city hum, the same hum I'd noticed months ago when I first watched her organize her mail. I realized then that I had memorized these rhythms, the way she folds a napkin, the tilt of her head when she laughs softly, the slight tremble of her hands when she's worried. I think she noticed I noticed. And maybe that mattered more than words ever could. There were still pauses, still hesitations, still moments where I wondered if I'd overstepped, or if she might pull back. But those were tempered by familiarity, by trust, by the tiny, deliberate care that grew between us. One evening, as the sun faded, She nudged her gun, its mine, on the kitchen counter. Just like we'd done weeks ago at the coffee shop. I caught her eye, and she just smiled, a quiet, steady smile. Nothing flashy, nothing sweeping, it didn't need to be, it said everything. I leaned back slightly, letting the warmth settle in my chest. The world outside kept moving. The city, the rain, the leaves. But in that small, ordinary kitchen, everything was exactly right. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel paused. I didn't feel uncertain. I just felt present. The small rhythms of our lives, the bench, the black coffee, the almost silent mornings, the folded napkins, the cold thermos left forgotten, became grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just quiet, earned closeness. Sometimes, when she laughs softly, I think about the first time she said, "I feel guilty already." And I smile, because I finally understand. The guilt, the hesitation, the small missteps, they were all part of this. All part of noticing. All part of being here, together, even in the quietest way.